Last week, Declan Rice pointed out in a Europa League press conference that last season, from June to June, he played 68 matches, describing that as an obscene amount of games. The 40-second clip of Rice airing his grievances and describing the difficulty of staying fit for both West Ham and England and how knackered he felt between games went viral on social media, getting millions of views and prompting plenty of discussion. Most of that discussion was critical, as tends to be the case when this issue is raised, so much so that Rice actually felt obliged to tweet himself, stating, "Wasn't hitting out at all, actually expressed how much I love playing in every game, and want to play every game if you watch the full press conference." From start to finish, Rice's sharing of his own experiences, the backlash, and then his backtracking, followed the playbook of what happens when players and coaches complain about there being too many games to an absolute T. The typical response whenever a footballer alludes to the fact that they play a lot of games goes something like this. "Oh, do shut up, would you? You're paid an absolute fortune. You're playing football for a living, not working on an oil rig. My nan spent 87 years working 25-hour days down an asbestos mine for threepence a week. And I did 3 tours of Afghanistan where I was shot in the head 8 times, died twice, and got blown up by an IED, all for 22 grand a year, and you don't hear me complaining." Alright, I am caricaturing the template response though, only a little bit, and the overwhelming response from football fans when the issue of player welfare and fixture congestion is raised by players or managers, as is becoming increasingly common, is to dismiss and deride those concerns as being the farcical complaints of pampered, overpaid prima donnas. And I get it, to be honest. While so many people are working all hours for peanuts, struggling just to pay their rent, mortgage, or energy bills, sympathy for those earning more in a week than most of us do in a year is always likely to be in short supply. But it doesn't really deal with the argument that is being made, and the fact that that initial response does tend to be so dismissive means that rarely does anyone stop to consider the actual pitfalls of players playing as many as 70 plus games in a single season, and whether that is actually a good thing for football fans, let alone the players themselves. So, in this video, I wanted to have that discussion around why players are playing so many games at the moment, with that number still rising, whether it is as big of an issue as some players and managers have made out, or whether they are indeed just a big bunch of overpaid babies who ought to shut up and get on with doing their jobs, just like all the rest of us, typically for far less adulation and financial reward. I know, right? It should be fun. The first point that we ought to address is just why there are so many games to begin with. From the proposed European Super League to UEFA's expansion of the Champions League and FIFA's proposals to make the World Cup a biennial tournament rather than it only being once every 4 years, wherever you look, the charge towards more and more football is incessant. The motivation, in almost every instance, is financial. FIFA wants a biennial World Cup because the World Cup is their only major cash cow. In fact, outside of the years in which there is a World Cup, FIFA isn't even a profitable organisation. It is the World Cup, and the World Cup alone, that sustains all of FIFA's other activities and makes them an enormously profitable organisation. In 2018, FIFA generated revenue of $4.64 billion compared to $544, $502, and $734 million in 2015, 2016, and 2017, and $766, $266, and $766 million again in 2019, 2020, and 2021. It is predicted that FIFA will rake in $4.6 billion once again in 2022, the year of the Qatar World Cup. FIFA, therefore, want twice as many World Cups, because right now, UEFA is leaving them in the dust when it comes to revenue, and they want to be the major financial players in world football. None of this is rocket science. Unlike FIFA, UEFA is not enormously reliant on a single international tournament, held only once every 4 years, though they do still make, on average, an extra €2.5 billion during a men's European Championship year. That is because UEFA's club competitions, the Super Cup, the Conference League, the Europa League, and most notably the Champions League, rake in around €3 billion a season on their own. A biennial Euros would be nice for UEFA, but they don't need it in the same way that FIFA does. Plus, UEFA's income has been rising pretty substantially, year on year, for most of the last 20 years, as they have maximised the media and commercial rights of their competitions, up from €1.7 billion as recently as the 2013-14 season, for example, to €3.8 billion in the 2018-19 campaign, before COVID struck. Meanwhile, FIFA's revenue, outside of the World Cup, which has seen a similar rise in marketability and profitability in of itself, has largely plateaued. Higher, in fact, in 2013 than it has been in any non-World Cup year since then. Nonetheless, UEFA still aren't content themselves, recently having approved an expansion and radical reform of the Champions League, which I have made a whole video about, which will see the addition of 4 extra teams each season and more than 100 additional games. This comes only 12 months after the creation of the UEFA Conference League, UEFA's new tertiary competition, which I actually really like and think is great for clubs from lesser nations, but was nonetheless created for purely financial reasons. Then you have the clubs themselves, especially the biggest ones, who know that they are the major pull and source of most of UEFA's revenue, hence proposals like the European Super League, where these clubs would be able to keep all of that revenue in-house. I have given FIFA and UEFA as just 2 examples, given that they are the 2 largest governing bodies in world football, but from the heights of the Premier League to the depths of the Papa John's deep dish pineapple and pepperoni meat feast pizza trophy, the reasoning is the same wherever you look. The FA Cup is a vital source of revenue for the Football Association, as is the EFL Cup for the EFL. And that is why England is one of the few countries which still has 2 major domestic cup competitions. Somewhat amusingly, whenever an organisation proposes some kind of reform or a new competition that would result in more games being played, the response from all of the other organisations is, "Don't be so ridiculous. There are already far too many games. By God, man, won't you think of the welfare of the players?" And then, lo and behold, about 3 weeks later, they're drawing up proposals for their own new 88-team tournament with a 12-team group stage and 8-legged knockout ties. Again, I am only slightly exaggerating for effect. Alexander Cheferin, for example, the president of UEFA, said in opposition to FIFA's proposals for a biennial World Cup that, quote, "To play every summer a 1-month tournament, for the players it's a killer. If it's every 2 years, it clashes with the Women's World Cup and the Olympic football tournament." A killer. That is what a World Cup every 2 years would be. But 100 extra Champions League games? Well, that's just a jolly good time. It would seem as though, as far as the chiefs of every league and organisation are concerned, whilst they are perfectly aware of the problems with playing too many games, apparently their fixtures don't actually cause fatigue. It is just like one of those unexplained scientific phenomena. In terms of what those problems are, well, now that is a science that can actually be explained. Clearly, the more games of fast, competitive football that someone plays, the higher the probability that they will get injured. That is just a statistical fact, even if there was no issue with fixture congestion, albeit obviously an unavoidable and fairly banal one. But FIFPro, which is the organisation that represents professional footballers worldwide, in conjunction with KPMG, have found that there is a very particular set of circumstances which they have termed the critical zone, which leads to much higher instances of injuries. The critical zone refers to any time that a professional footballer plays more than 45 minutes of football with fewer than 5 days rest between games. That might not sound all that extreme, and indeed FIFPro are not suggesting that players be banned outright from playing during the so-called critical zone due to the heightened risk of injuries, but they are proposing a cap on the number of games that each player can play in during that critical zone each season, as is the case with basketball players in the NBA, and their suggestion is that that limit be just 6 games. That would represent a pretty radical set of regulations, given that currently, elite-level players competing in European or their equivalent continental competitions and in international fixtures sometimes play as many as 70 to 80% of their games over the course of any given season during that critical zone. Nonetheless, when FIFPro polled their members, 9 out of 10 professional footballers agreed with their maximum of 6 critical zone games per season, and with an overall cap on fixtures, which would cap the total number of appearances any player could make in a season at 55. Clearly, the logistics of that would be very difficult. In the NBA, the rest periods for star players tend to be determined well in advance, but in football, players are competing on so many different fronts, and around 20% of their games are internationals, that determining how and when they would be rested would be far from straightforward. Assuming a player's 55th game of a particular season was a World Cup semi-final, and their team emerged victorious, it is hard to imagine fans, managers, or the players themselves being particularly pleased if they were forced to miss the World Cup final. Perhaps there are ways that you could work around that, but at this stage, even with over 87% support from professional footballers themselves, it is hard to see it being implemented anytime soon. It's important to note that players are well aware that the drive for more games means more revenue, and also therefore that fewer games is likely to mean less revenue and potentially lower wages for them. But still they favour at least a moderate restriction on fixture congestion and total games played over the course of a season, and it is quite possible that such restrictions, even with a slight reduction in salaries, could still be in their rational self-interest. Let's just take the example of Barcelona wonderkid Pedri. One of the most exceptional teenage talents in all of world football, Pedri joined Barcelona from Las Palmas in 2020 for €5 million, aged 17, having already played 37 times for the club from Gran Canaria. In his first season at Barcelona, aged 17 to 18, Pedri made a combined total of 71 appearances for Barcelona in Spain, as he featured in 2 international tournaments in a single summer with Spain, reaching the semi-final of the Euros and the final of the Olympic Games. That is, an average of 1 game every 5 days, discounting any pre-season or club friendlies for an entire year, meaning that the vast majority of Pedri's appearances came during the so-called critical zone, and he often played 3 games within the space of a week. Last season, aged 18 to 19, off the back of playing 71 games in a season, Pedri suffered 3 separate hamstring injuries, sidelining him for 6 months and causing him to miss 31 games, not counting the 2 games that he also missed due to COVID. Now, football players get injured. It is a fact of life and part and parcel of the job. Everyone accepts that. It is possible, therefore, that Pedri could have played 30 games in the 2020-21 season rather than 71 and still have had 3 hamstring injuries in 2021-22. But this is about probability, and playing a game of frantic, aggressive, elite-level football every 5 days for an entire year in your teens with no real period of rest, quite obviously, increases the likelihood of sustaining both short and long-term injury problems. FIFPro, in reaching their conclusion around the critical zone, took data from 40,000 appearances, with a sample made up of 265 male players from 44 different leagues between June 2018 and August 2021. What they found was not just that cumulative exposure to matches over a short period of time is the key cause of injuries among players, but also that those at the very pinnacle of the game, who travel for matches with their club sides and sometimes great distances to represent their national teams, were seeing significantly worse health and performance outcomes as a result of the travel, switching between different time zones, and the fixture congestion. When you talk about the mental well-being of footballers, or indeed anyone in some cases, you can be met with eyes rolling and lost attention. Yet we know that professional athletes suffer from even higher rates of depression and mental illness than the general population. Having no rest between games, and essentially no summer or winter break anymore for some players, takes not just a physical, but also a psychological and mental toll on players. It is all well and good to make comparisons with players from bygone eras, who typically did enjoy much longer off-seasons even at the elite level than modern players do, but between games, they were also able to have some downtime. It wasn't uncommon, not all that long ago, for even international players to go to the pub, socialise, have a few drinks, and switch off from football on a couple of evenings between games. Now the demands on players are absolutely off the charts, and even when they are allowed brief periods of downtime, their every move is followed, photographed, and scrutinised by press packs. It is hardly what most of us would consider to be relaxing downtime. If you talk to professional footballers, whilst they are frequently in pain and almost always knackered, it is often the psychological battle of constantly being 100% motivated and focused on the next game, and the next one, and then the one after that, when there is no break between them, that really gets to them. You can dismiss those difficulties if you like, but they have been vocalised by serial Champions League, Premier League, and World Cup winners, so they are not, therefore, the complaints of players who are mentally weak or lack bottle, but just the honest admission of the very best in the business. On the physical side, most players experience chronic, sometimes even crippling pain, particularly in retirement and in later life, but also during their careers. A recent article in The Athletic, authored by Sarah Shepherd, included a survey of 100 former professional players, over a third of whom now reported having osteoarthritis. Given that almost half of the respondents were aged 35 to 44, those numbers ought to be alarming. Steven Gerrard recently pointed out that he has screws in his hips, he has had to have 16 operations, and he now struggles to even go to the gym, aged 42. Gerrard wasn't stating any of that to raise concerns about player welfare, but actually to dismiss them, in response to Bukayo Saka calling for players to receive more protection from referees after a game against Aston Villa. He'll learn, and he'll learn quick, was Gerrard's observation. At no point did Gerrard seem to reflect on whether his predicament could be avoided or might actually be less than ideal, and it was a similar story with Roy Keane, who recently spoke about how Ruud van Nistelrooy used to refuse to play games when injured. I know, right, the bloody coward. Whereas Roy would play through injuries and openly admits that his body was ruined as a result before he had even retired. Gerrard and Keane have suffered far from the worst of it though. Matt Paper, formerly of Leicester City and Sunderland, went under the knife more than 20 times before he retired at the age of 26. Piper took the decision to hang up his boots after being told by a doctor that if he tried to continue playing, he would likely end up in a wheelchair by the time that he was 40. Gabriel Batistuta, one of the greatest strikers of his generation, if not of all time, was experiencing such excruciating pain in his ankles by the time that he retired in 2005, aged 36, that he could barely walk. So severe was the pain that Batistuta would even wet himself in bed rather than attempting the few steps to the toilet, and he later requested that a surgeon amputate both of his legs just to take the pain away. These are specific cases, but they are far from unique. Many footballers relocate to warmer climates in retirement to try and relieve the symptoms of their osteoarthritis. And even during their careers, though fans rarely witness it, players who we think of as being fit, as though fit and injured were two distinct categories and there was no in between, are actually in acute pain, can't train, and can hardly walk, sometimes receiving injections which can have really damaging long-term side effects just to get them through the next 90 minutes. The reality is that whilst footballers are extremely well paid, at least at the very highest level, they are still treated as commodities by the clubs, who we somewhat perversely describe as owning them. When a player has a problem relating to their health, fitness, or general well-being, the priority is rarely what is the best course of action for them as a human being, and almost exclusively, what is the best course of action for the football club in terms of getting them back on the pitch and back performing as soon as possible. It is for that reason that players are so often pressured by clubs to go under the knife and to receive surgery for injuries that you or I would be told to just let to rest and recover. You might think that players get access to the best medical professionals, and that is to a certain extent true, but not always to the best advice. For most people, surgery is a last resort, but if it can get a player back a month or 2 months earlier, rarely will a club not go for it. The fact that a footballer, who has been cut open more times than a blind butcher, probably won't be able to walk in their 40s and 50s, or at least not without severe discomfort, that is given a lot less consideration than those extra couple of months that they could play for, and the 16 points up for grabs during that time. It's also worth emphasising that, whilst I don't think that earning lots of money is adequate compensation for being crippled in work, most professional footballers aren't multi-millionaires. We are hyper-fixated with the Lionel Messis and Cristiano Ronaldos of this world, but for a second, third and fourth division player across the planet, and indeed top-flight players in some countries, they might not even earn more than the domestic average wage. It is no different, therefore, to advocate for the welfare of footballers than it is to advocate for better working conditions and protections for labourers who work on building sites, and who, in many instances, earn similar amounts of money to lower league and non-league professional footballers and can suffer from very similar pains and negative long-term health problems. Something that I very rarely do on this channel is quote Steve Bruce, who was recently sacked by West Bromwich Albion, but a point that Bruce repeatedly used to make when he was asked about fixture congestion and other managers complaining about there being too many fixtures is that footballers could play a match every single day. They're fit young men, Bruce liked to point out, they could do it. And they would if they were instructed to do so. They'd just be absolutely knackered. The quality of football they produced would deteriorate day after day, as would their bodies, and injuries would become an increasingly frequent occurrence. I've always thought that was an accurate observation. As football fans, we love football. It sort of comes with the territory, by definition. And therefore, the tendency can be to want more of it, and inevitably, we will watch lots of it, no matter how often it's on. But we also like watching good football, or most of us do at least, seeing players play at their absolute max, and teams being at full strength, rather than plagued by injury crises. So many football fans seem to think that their specific teams have suffered uniquely terrible injury crises in recent years, when the reality is just that they are becoming much more common, despite players' diets, training regimes, strength and conditioning, physios, team doctors, and all the rest of it never having been more professional or informed. So for fans, who often seem to be so dismissive, as well as for the players themselves, having a crammed schedule and putting unnatural and unreasonable physical stresses and strains on players might not actually benefit anyone. Aside from the chief executives and presidents, of course. If we want to see the highest quality football, with the highest quality players on show, and producing their best football due to being physically and mentally ready to go into games, slightly fewer fixtures would certainly be one solution. The problem, it should be said, is even worse in some continents than it is for top players in Europe. In countries such as Russia and the United States, the travel for some teams in between games, for away fixtures, makes every other weekend effectively like going on an international break. In Brazil, in particular, not only is travel an issue, but the number of games can be absurd, when you have state championships, state tournaments, nationwide championships, nationwide tournaments, and then continental competitions to boot. When people question why so many Brazilian footballers seem to tail off in their late 20s or early 30s, either losing focus or suffering from recurring injury problems, or both, I sometimes wonder whether that might be a consideration. Neymar, for example, had already played 229 games by the time that he was 20 years old, before signing for Barcelona, 202 of them for Santos, and a further 27 for Brazil. There is just no way in which that can be healthy. And Neymar has never played as many games in a single season as he did at the age of 18. It is quite possible, therefore, that it is the stupid amount of games that he played during his teens that has deprived us of witnessing Neymar, who is undoubtedly one of the most talented footballers of his generation, throughout so much of his peak years at PSG, where injuries have limited him to just 157 appearances in 5.5 seasons, or an average of 28 a season compared to the 60 that he played for Santos in 2010. So when footballers complain about fixture congestion, playing too many games, and never having time for their minds or bodies to rest, you are, of course, free to dismiss those concerns. Stick them on a building site and see if they still complain, however, is not a particularly compelling counter-argument, aside from the fact that some footballers have literal experience working on building sites and earn less than your average brickie, whilst only a fraction earn millions. It completely misses the point. No amount of money turns you into a bionic man, unless you are Iron Man, I suppose, which, I would remind you, is fictional. You could throw an extra £100,000 a week at Kevin De Bruyne, and it isn't going to physiologically change the composition of his being. His muscles and bones will remain all too human, and therefore just as likely to break down when exhausted. So, as a great man once said, players can play every day of the week. It's just a question of the intensity that they can play at, how often they'll get injured, and the long-term impacts that those stresses, strains, and injuries will have. Admittedly, I'm sure he said it much more eloquently than that. Cheers, Steve. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. I hope that you enjoyed it. Hit the like button if that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. And feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on Twitter and on Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.